to have here today Professor Miguel Maduro to conduct the conference. Today's conference is in English for two reasons. One, the topic is an international issue, and it is also a way for people from other communities to come here and participate and express their opinions regarding to this topic. I would like to remind you that after the conference we will have a period for debate, and all of you can participate and giving your opinion or ask questions to Professor. So I will pass immediately start the conference, Professor Maduro.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Muito obrigado pelo convite. Just to say some words in Portuguese. I'm very happy to accept the invitation, and I thank the Foundation, Dr. very much for having invited me, and Dr. Salas Marcus too for having helped in that respect, and also for welcoming me in Macau for so many times now in the past, and again this time in the context of the Institute of European Studies of Macau. And I'm going to try to do three things with my talk, and try to stay within the boundaries of time that were attributed to me, so that we will have an opportunity to, as much as possible, discuss. It is difficult for me to know exactly what are the forms of interest that a talk, a lecture on the crisis in Europe may give rise to in Macau. And so I think that one of the best ways to actually answer to your expectations is by giving as much time as possible for questions and answers time, and I will try to do that. But in any event, I will try to do three things. I will try to explain the current crisis of the euro and how it has become a crisis of European integration, and what is the possible solutions for that. What are the possible solutions that are on the table, what I see as the problems with the predominant solution that is being put forward, and what I conceive also as a possible alternative. And in that respect, by the way, I'm basically doing the same thing that I did last week in the European Parliament. I've been asked by the European Parliament to prepare a report with some possible alternatives for solutions in addressing the crisis and the European governance. And to a certain extent, what I'm doing here is talking a little bit about some of those proposals that I'm going to put forward. The second part of my talk will be about the possible consequences that this crisis has for Asia and for the world, and what does it tell us about the interdependence that we have at the global level. And the third part of my talk will be more focused on what may be some of the legal consequences of this crisis, and also what it may tell us about the changing nature of law, and particularly the new challenges that lawyers and judges, for example, will face in the context of a role that law is calling to play or not to play in the context of a crisis such as the crisis of the euro, and broadly the financial and economic crisis at the global level. So let me start by explaining and discussing a little bit the nature of the crisis of the euro and how it became a crisis of European integration. Now, the euro is, to a large extent, an European answer to the challenges of globalization. It was supposed to give Europe a strategic advantage in the context of globalization. And in fact, it has given that to Europe in many respects for several years. But the euro also enhanced the interdependence that by itself was already the product of the process of European integration. And if there's something that can sum up the present crisis in Europe, is the following, in my view. This crisis makes clear our interdependence,
but also our failure to internalize the consequences of such interdependence. And this failure, I will argue, is a democratic failure. So my argument is actually that the best way to understand this fiscal and economic crisis is by making a democratic reading of this crisis. And I will explain why. And it is only if we understand the democratic failures that are at the basis, at the origin of the euro crisis, that we then will be able to design the correct solutions to address the crisis and prevent future crises. Now, the euro and the European Union have, in my view, become the victim of two types of democratic malfunctions. Two types of democratic malfunctions that the mechanism of governance in Europe that was set up following the economic and monetary union was not successful in addressing. And these two types of democratic failures, democratic malfunctions if you want, can be linked to the two different narratives that one finds with respect to the crisis. These two narratives are the following. One is a narrative that blames the irresponsible fiscal and economic policies of some states and says the origin for this crisis is the fact that the European Economic and Monetary Union was not successful in keeping states disciplined, in managing their finances, in managing their fiscal and budgetary policies. This is one narrative. And therefore, this meant that the irresponsible or wrong fiscal policies, budgetary policies in some states then produce negative externalities in other states, creating a domino effect that is spreading the crisis. But this first narrative has a second alternative narrative that is often put forward. And is the narrative that often I identify as the equivalent of the American of the narrative of the American financial crisis. It's very curious because if we look at how the American crisis was understood and how blame was attributed in the American financial crisis of 2008, what we see is that to a large extent there was some similarities in the two crises. That is, it was a crisis that was a result of too much debt being incurred, in that instance, mostly private debt. But the responsibility there was mostly put on those that provided the loans. That is, the responsibility was attributed to those that made loans too easily accessible to people that could not afford it. And to a certain extent, there is an alternative narrative of the euro crisis that picks up on this American narrative. And is a narrative that puts the focuses on financial fluxes from northern central banks that had too much liquidity and therefore made money too easily accessible in the south, lower interest rates too much, and triggered an excess of debt in the south. This is, as I say, an alternative narrative. In reality, probably both of these narratives have something of truth to them. They both partly explain the crisis, and the crisis can best be understood in light of both of these two narratives. But what I want to stress in here is that underlying these two narratives are two democratic malfunctions. In the first narrative, what we have is a problem of what I call of interstate democratic externalities. The interdependence generated by monetary union means that the fiscal policy adopted in one state has consequences that can be severe negative consequences for other states. And this can be reconstructed as a democratic problem, because the states that suffer those negative consequences have no saying on the fiscal policies of the states that create those problems. This is a democratic malfunction, a democratic failure. But the second narrative can also be associated with a democratic failure. The democratic failure in that instance is the incapacity of states or in this instance, even the European Union, to control transnational processes of power, in this case, transnational financial transactions, transnational financial fluxes, that because of mobility of capital can no longer be individually controlled by states, and therefore are no longer subject to democratic accountability in any state, are no longer subject to the regulatory authority of any state, and that the European Union itself, by lack of sufficient competences or political authority, has not been able to control. When we hear the claims about speculation in the markets about the rating agencies, what we have is the idea that somehow, the perception that somehow there are economic forces at play that states, on even the European Union, can no longer control. And this can be seen as a democratic problem. So I think that it's very important for us to detect that, in fact, the origin of the crisis, of the financial crisis, can be, to a large extent also, identified as a democratic problem, as a democratic failure, both with respect to the fact that states now adopt policies that have negative externalities on other states, that have no voices on what are the policies of the first states, but also that there are increasingly economic processes that evade the control of any national democracy or even the European Union. But furthermore, the incapacity that the European Union political process has shown in addressing the crisis is itself a continuation of this democratic failure to internalize the consequences of interdependence. What is that failure? That failure that explains why the European Union has not been able to successfully address the crisis is, in my view, linked to what I call a political gap. There is certain problems now can only be decided at European level, can only be successfully addressed at European level. The euro has made this evident, obvious, that we can only address the problems of the euro at European level. But at the same time, what determines what are the policies to be decided at European level are national political spaces. And these national political spaces have not internalized the consequences of interdependence. And because they have not internalized the consequences of interdependence, they do not provide the right political incentives for action at the European level. In other words, to make this example clear, and to give two different examples that hopefully will make this clear. Mrs. Merkel is constantly criticized for not having sufficient political will to promote and support at European level the answers that are necessary to the crisis. But in fact, Mrs. Merkel is simply answering, being responsive to her own political opinion, to the constituency that elects her. The overwhelming public opinion in Germany believes that Germany has already done too much, that Germany has already guaranteed too much, has already taken up too much risk with respect to the other member states. And why is that? Because the German public opinion has not internalized the consequences of the interdependence that is generated by monetary integration. Most public opinion in Germany both is not aware of the advantages that Germany has gained in terms of the euro, and also is not aware of the possible tremendous negative consequences for Germany if the euro was to collapse. And so the national political space in Germany does not provide the right incentives for action, and in turn, the European policies are determined by those different national political spaces. And I could give you a different example. When the first time that there was a kind of a sketch of an agreement to help Spain, what happened? Mr. Rajoy came, and instead of taking into account that he was no longer talking only for Spain, but he was talking for Europe, he was more concerned in presenting that deal to his own public opinion as a victory of Spain with respect to the other member states, and as having got a deal that no other of the previous states had been able to got, And therefore, that immediately created a backlash in the other states that made it impossible for that solution to be supported. And therefore, we had a block. And the same happened when there was the agreement with Mr. Monti, and Mr. Monti came and presented as being the win. And of course, then, the following days, Mrs. Merkel had to say, no, we didn't agree that, and she reintroduced veto. The Dutch also claimed to reintroduce veto. What does this tell us? It tells us that we cannot have European policies that depend on national politics, on the individual national politics. Because and therefore this gap between where policies have to be decided at European level and the national and the political spaces that remain national, that shape those policies, this gap makes it very difficult for Europe to provide the answers that are necessary. And to a large extent, what some people present as the lack of solidarity in Europe is itself, again, a new, simply more evidence of this lack of internalization of the consequences of interdependence. In this instance, of the lack of internalization of the benefits of the interdependence that is generated by European integration. So, if we want to address the crisis in Europe, we have to understand the democratic nature of the origin of the crisis, and also the political gap and the political problems that explain why we haven't been able to address the crisis successfully. So how can we address the crisis? In my view, we need to secure a series of conditions. The first one is we need certainty. Markets claim for certainty in this instance. In the United States, for example, in Europe, everyone considers that it's a problem if a state will default. In the United States, that has happened. Individual states have defaulted without any problem occurring or without the dollar being put into question. But why does that happen? Because people know that there is an effective political authority that can intervene if necessary. That there is a federal budget that, if necessary, can help those states. That there is a political authority that can intervene and insulate other states if necessary. There is political authority to provide certainty. In Europe, for the reasons that I just mentioned, political authority is too diffuse. It can be blocked by the actions of any single national political space. And because that is so, we will never be able to provide the certainty that markets want in order for the euro to survive. The second thing we need to do is to re-establish mutual trust. This crisis, both what is perceived by some states has the fiscal irresponsibility of other states, not to say in one particular case as the fiscal cheating of one state, but also then the response of other states that are perceived by some as not being sufficiently solidarity. This crisis has profoundly eroded already the mutual trust that is necessary for the process of European integration. And so therefore, any solution for the crisis must be able to develop mechanisms that will re-establish mutual trust between the peoples of Europe. Third thing, and this is very important for the re-establishment of this mutual trust, we need to render both the benefits and the democratic consequences of the interdependence generated by European integration, and by monetary union in particular, visible before European citizens. And I will tell in a moment how I think we should do that. Fourth, we need to legitimate financial solidarity in Europe, and we can only do so, in my view, and I will also explain why and how, by relating it to the wealth that's generated by the process of European integration. That is, any monetary union requires financial solidarity. This financial solidarity will only be able to be legitimated if it is somehow linked to the wealth that is created by the process of European integration itself. Fifth, we need to link political integration and financial solidarity. That is, if we have financial solidarity, we need transfer of powers to the European union level. That is, no taxation without representation. But we also need the reverse. There is also no representation without taxation. There is no successful political community without some sense of distributive justice. And as such, if it is true, as it is often said, that there can be no taxation without representation, I would claim there is also no possibility of representation without taxation. All this means somehow that we need a fiscal union. And increasingly, we hear calls for that. We hear calls from that even by some of the more relevant political leaders in Europe, such as Mrs. Merkel. But what does this fiscal union mean? This is much more unclear. We do not know what exactly is meant when many people refer to this need of a fiscal union. It does seem that all agree that it needs some degree, how much and by whom is unclear, of European control over national budgetary and fiscal policies. That's the first point. It does seem to need some degree of financial fiscal solidarity. But how and to which extent is also discussed. It also then needs some forms of democratic legitimation of the new powers that the European Union is to acquire in the context of this fiscal union. I will say that there is a kind of a sketch of an agreement on the need for these three things, but how exactly they are going to be achieved, in which order and in which manner, is deeply contested. And difficult even to envision how to make it politically possible. There seems to be three models emerging in this respect. The first one is the model that was originally developed, for example, with the stability that is embedded in the Stability Treaty, the new Stability Treaty, but also in the famous six-pack legislation, the series of legislative measures that the European Union adopted to control and supervise national budgets and fiscal policies of the member states. This is a model that basically focuses on fiscal discipline. That is, the idea is that, well, the previous Stability Pact didn't work because it was not sufficient and it was not properly enforced. If we develop sufficient fiscal disciplinary rules and if we properly enforce it, maybe it will be possible for the economic monetary union to survive only through fiscal discipline. But in my view, this will never work. First, it will never work economically because, and I will not focus in that even because I'm not an economist, but it is obvious, I know of no monetary union where all its constitutive parts are at any given moment always in surplus, in trade surplus, in budgetary surplus. So I don't think that is viable. I think it's a dream to believe that it will be possible for us to attain that in Europe. And this means, and one of the reasons is because the fiscal discipline would always depend on underlying economic conditions. As we see in this crisis in Europe, for example, Ireland had no budget deficit, had a very limited, low ratio of public debt, but suddenly, because of a crisis in its banking system, it found itself having a sovereign debt crisis. So that's a very good example of how you can predict when financial solidarity on the part of the other states will be necessary. And if there's something that is certain, is that any monetary union will always require some forms of financial solidarity. The question is how and under which conditions are we going to set up those forms. But moreover, and more importantly, I don't think that only fiscal discipline, only rules will work. It will not work politically. And this is the more important point for me. It will not work politically because it will undermine the political and social legitimacy of the Union. And this is so because either national political processes will preserve autonomy and effectiveness over budgetary rules, and therefore the discipline rules, the fiscal discipline, will not work, Or if they will not preserve it, then such fiscal rules, in the absence of financial solidarity, in the absence of a common politics in Europe, will be seen as putting democracy itself into question, as we are seeing already. Now, the tendency seems in fact to have a mix between an agreement on tougher fiscal discipline, stronger fiscal supervision, European supervision of national fiscal policies, and that is stronger transfer of competences to the European level on fiscal policies, with some forms of some degrees of financial solidarity, of fiscal transfers between the states. That is, some degree of mutualization of the debt that will occur. The question, and this is the debate in Europe, is whether if this should occur now, and then we have stronger centralization of fiscal power, stronger fiscal discipline, or if, for example, as the Germans seem to argue, we need fiscal discipline, fiscal consolidation first, and then we can have financial solidarity, we can have mutualization of the debts. But in my view, if we see the discussions now in Europe, they seem to be heading in this direction. There is some openness in some of the political leaders in Germany to the idea of some mutualization of the debt, but limited, in exchange for fiscal discipline. But they say only after fiscal consolidation has been achieved. And at the same time, there is the idea that somehow the legitimation of this fiscal discipline that will be achieved by the stronger European supervision of national budgets and national fiscal policies could be done by a legitimacy that will be granted through a stronger role of national parliaments or by the intergovernmental mechanisms in the Council. That is what we are witnessing. But in my view, I want to be very skeptical in here. I don't think that this will work. I don't think that this will work, again, for economic and political reasons. First, in my view, it will not work because this mechanism is basically one where some states will be providing insurance to the debt of other states. But moreover, either this insurance will be limited and will be conditional or national approval, as it is the case now, for example, in Germany, even on the basis of the decision of the German Constitutional Court. That is, every time that there is to be an increase on the aid packages or new interventions, new adjustment programs, new bailouts of other states, the national German parliament has to intervene and agree. And if that is so a mechanism that is dependent on this possibility of veto at national level, we never provide the certainty that is necessary. It will again, the political authority for this will be too diffuse to provide markets with the certainty that there is a sufficient political will if the need will arise to intervene. So it will not work in economic terms. But moreover, in my point of view, it will not work politically. It will not work politically because the political opinion, public opinion in the states that are in better economic position, that are in position of having to help the other ones, does not want, and I would say legitimately so, to insure the debt of other states without having what they consider to be effective control on those states. Why? What Germans tell to me is to say, why should we be guaranteeing the debt of Portugal, Spain, Italy, when we don't decide what they do with that money? Why should we do it? We are putting our own future at risk because we might get to be liable for that debt, and we don't have voice on how that money is going to be used. But moreover, on the other side, the states that are being supported, that will be helped by these measures, what will they perceive by a regime that is based basically on these mutual guarantees between states that are then governed collectively at European level by the different national governments? What they will be perceiving is that they will be subject to the authority of other national governments or the other states. So they will perceive exactly the opposite. And this will be highly corrosive for the legitimacy of the process of European integration, the political and social legitimacy, but I will say even highly corrosive of national democratic systems. So I don't think first that this is politically viable, that we will be able to get the political will necessary in the states to get to this result. And moreover, I think that the outcome of this might be very risky in terms of political and democratic legitimacy. So, what is the alternative? My alternative is one where what is fundamentally necessary to do is to cut the link between the financial solidarity, the guarantee that is necessary to be provided by the European Union in terms of financial solidarity to a monetary union, the financial support that is necessary of monetary union, and transfers from the states. That is, the only way to do that is by having a genuine European Union budget. The American Federation, for example, can have the American Federation doesn't have jointly issue bonds by all the states. It doesn't need that. Why? Because it has a sufficiently strong federal budget. A federal budget that is then supported on resources of the federal government itself. We will not need in Europe to have a federal budget of the size of the American one, that is more than 30% of GDP, but we certainly need a budget that is superior to the 1% that we currently have in Europe. When the Economic Monetary Union was created in Europe, some of the studies that supported it, and some people forget that, had as an assumption that by now the budget of the European Union will be 3% of the GDP. It has remained exactly the same that it was then, 1%. If the Union will have a sufficiently large budget, it could intervene directly to correct some of the asymmetries that are the symmetric shocks that emerge in the context of a monetary union. Moreover, it could issue its own bonds guaranteed by the European Union. It could provide the necessary guarantees for a banking union. That is one of the other difficulties we have now. Everyone recognizes that we need a banking union in Europe, but we can't get the states to agree on jointly guaranteeing. Why? Because again, Germans will say, why should we be guaranteeing banks in Portugal, Spain, or Italy? The solution passes by having a sufficiently strong EU budget. That could be probably 5% of GDP will be more than enough. And how to achieve it? How to do it? The way to do it is by linking that budget to resources that are own resources of the European Union, and by linking in turn those resources to the economic wealth that is generated by the process of economic integration in Europe. Any economist of trade will tell you that the economic wealth that is generated by economic integration in Europe is much, much superior to the budget that the European Union has. And yet, that is not reflected on the budget of the European Union. And it is possible, in my view, to devise revenues for the European Union that the citizens will understand as being revenues that are linked to the wealth that the European Union creates, or to the activities that the European Union, in which the European Union presents an added value with respect to the states. Very briefly, let me give you just some examples. Financial transactions tax is one example. Particularly if it's a cross-border financial transactions tax. It will correct some of the distortions of mobility of capital, and citizens, it will be acceptable by citizens, and citizens can understand why that tax should go to the European Union, because it's a product, it's linked to the mobility of capital that is created in the context of the internal market. But for example, another case will be a tax on CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions is one example of an externality that one state creates on the other. If the European Union taxes that, it's both limiting the externalities that states cause on other states and getting a resource of its own. But we could also think about, for example, a tax that is similar but not the same as is being discussed in the United States on online sales profits. You know that when you buy now in Europe on Amazon, you're buying products from Luxembourg. Why? Because The Amazon has iTunes, for example, they are all in Luxembourg. Why? Because of the mobility of the right of establishment and the internal market. They choose the most beneficial tax regime in one of the member states. They use tax competition between the states. So why shouldn't the European Union be the one that is able to actually limit it, the extent of that competition without eliminating, and at the same time get an economic revenue out of that? If there is that tax mobility, if some states are benefiting from that, is because we have the internal market. Why shouldn't a percentage of that revenue go to the European Union? We can also reform the VAT regime, for example, in Europe, and there's been long discussions about that. And in the context of that reform, if the VAT regime will also start covering cross-border transactions, at the moment it stops in one state and then initiates again in another state, a percentage of that VAT that is charged on the cross-border transactions, on any transaction that then has a cross-border element, should go to the European Union. Why? Because citizens will understand again, because that's linked to the internal market. So my proposal is that it is very important that we associate the revenues of the European Union that will support a common European budget on revenues that are somehow linked before citizens with respect to the wealth that the European Union creates. Because if we will start talking about what should we do with the wealth of the European Union and not continue as we do today talking about how should German money be used to pay for other states, we will have a totally different conversation in Europe, and we will be able to arrive at much better solutions in the context of the current crisis. Now, there are elements in terms of political and democratic developments that I think are necessary for the Union to address properly the current crisis. And for example, I've defended that the elections for the European Parliament should be transformed into a choice for the President of the European Commission. So, as it happens in the Member States, parliamentary elections, not direct elections of the President of the European Commission, parliamentary elections as we have today, but to make those parliamentary elections really interesting in European terms, and to provide then to the President of the European Commission a political capital and the democratic legitimacy that it doesn't have today. There are other examples that I could mention to you, but I'm not going to get into it because I want to, at least very briefly, address the two other parts that I had promised to also talk about. Now, this addressing of this current crisis in Europe also depends on cooperation at the global level. But at the same time, the crisis is also closely linked both to the interdependence and competitive processes generated by globalization. Now, this crisis can be put in the context of a much broader rebalancing at the global level. If we look throughout the centuries, this kind of transfer, some people say that in fact Europe has to be prepared to become poorer. And in fact, to become poorer because what we're witnessing is a redistribution of wealth to areas of the region, such as Asia, that have been poorer than Europe. Some people understand it in this way, and that this crisis can be put. It's not only simply a sovereignty debt crisis. It's a crisis of the model of Europe. Is a crisis that is shifting, is signaling a much broader rebalancing in terms of economic wealth and in terms of power at the global level. But the crisis also makes clear how the economic growth in some other areas of the globe is increasingly important and fundamental for Europe to be able to address the crisis and its problems. For example, it is now obvious in Europe that any solution to the European crisis will pass and will depend on economic growth on other parts of the globe. Because of the adjustment programs that European states, some of European states are undertaking, are only effective if there is consumption, if there is demand coming for their products from other parts of the globe. And that demand is obviously not coming from Europe, because even the countries that were growing in Europe are now growing very limited. And therefore, the only solution for countries such as Portugal, for example, that is undergoing a kind of internal devaluation, that is because it can't evaluate the currency, is lowering production costs in order to try to become more competitive, the only option for such countries is to look for markets outside Europe. If it depends, therefore, on the increase of consumption in areas such as Asia. But at the same time, this crisis also makes clear how these same countries, such as China, that are being presented in Europe as part of the solution for the crisis, can very easily become victims of the crisis themselves. And the latest economic data that we have indicates to us that, in fact, what we may have is not countries such as, famously the BRICS countries such as India, China, and Brazil, becoming the engines of the world that will help Europe and the United States getting out of the crisis. They may become themselves contaminated by the crisis. What this tells us is that at the global level, we have to achieve and to understand that there's a balance between the competitive forces that are generated by globalization and the need for cooperation. That is, globalization promotes both competition between states and regions of the globe, but also requires cooperation. And it is very important that we do not assume that globalization puts in motion a zero-sum game between the states. It's very important that we do not assume, as it has been frequently until recently, that globalization is basically about competition. No. What this crisis is also making clear is that globalization is also, in many respects, about cooperation. We have to find the right mix between cooperation and competition at the global level. And I think that that's the broader challenge that we need to address. I also want very briefly to address, because I was asked to do so, some of the legal consequences, some of the legal lessons and challenges that this crisis brings to us. And the first one that I will highlight is the following. This crisis forces us to think about the limits of the law. Think about how we increasingly hear about the likelihood, if not the certainty, of the exit of the euro by Greece and even other states in the euro area. Legally, that is an impossibility. The treaties do not foresee such possibility. So by itself, a state exiting the euro will be a violation of the treaties. Or in the same way, a state being expelled by the euro would also be a violation of the treaties. But moreover, even if we admit that legal possibility, if for a state to leave the euro in a relatively controlled manner, and I will really put emphasis on the relative control manner, because I think this relative is very relative indeed, the state will have to do it by violating immediately a series of EU rules. That is, the state will have to impose controls, froze bank accounts, impose controls on free movement of capitals, all of which will be violations of free movement rules that are protected by EU treaties. And the state could not do that by first getting an authorization by EU institutions. First, because EU institutions cannot provide such authorization. Only the European Court, it's in the treaties, and the Commission itself and the Council have to respect the free movement rules that are in the treaty. Only the Court of Justice could, after a legal case be brought in, say that such restrictions of free movement rules are acceptable. And so it will immediately put in motion a series of legal challenges in terms of possible violations of treaty rules, of, if you want, of the economic constitution of the European Union. But also think about what will happen in terms of contracts. All the contracts that are now are in euros. In these countries, that will suddenly happen. What will happen? Will they then be fulfilled in terms of the new national currency? If not, if they will have to be fulfilled in terms of the euros, that means that leaving the euro might actually be much worse for the state and for the companies of that state, because they will have to devaluate the currency to pay for a euro, which they will not have anymore. What will happen in terms of this? So, moreover, what will happen, for example, in terms of deposit guarantees? I'm actually, and so I cannot talk much about it, I'm actually the legal advisor of Iceland in a case that was brought against Iceland by the UK, the Netherlands, the European Commission, and the EFTA authority when their entire banking system collapsed, and the deposit guarantee scheme was not able to pay the minimum amount of deposits that was there. You know that in a lot of states in Europe, the average, the guarantees of the deposits that we hear about, that are imposed by EU legislation, that guarantee deposits up to 100,000 euros, that everyone has their deposit guarantee. These are, in fact, guaranteed by a deposit guarantee fund that the states have set up. But these deposit guarantee funds can and cannot have all the money at their disposal. So if there were, for example, a systemic banking failure in most of the European countries, the average amount of state revenues that will be necessary to cover these deposits in terms of euros is 250% of the total revenues of states in a year. So it means that for almost 3 years, states could spend no money on nothing else but to pay the minimum deposit, the amount of deposits. So imagine if this will happen in a state that is to leave the euro, and they will still have to pay it in terms of euros, for example. You can see, you have already an idea of the absolute legal chaos that will ensue if a state will leave the euros. And of course, if the only thing that we are certain about is the legal uncertainty that this will cause, and the extent to which this legal uncertainty will provoke even greater economic chaos. So how law and what this will tell us about the law, it's one of the challenges that we will definitely have on the table. And particularly in this context then, this will bring even greater emphasis and to what we are already witnessing. That is the role that courts are playing in the context of this crisis. That is, one of the features of law in contemporary societies is the extent to which courts are increasingly being called in to decide on questions of great social, economic, and even political sensitivity. Therefore, courts are increasingly deciding on what we could call the borderline, the frontier between law and politics. And this crisis of the euro is only making that more obvious. Think about the recent decision in Portugal of the Portuguese Constitutional Court, but think too about the decisions of the German Constitutional Court. Everyone is suspended by what will be the next decision of the German Constitutional Court on whether or not they will consider, in particular, the Treaty on the European Stability Mechanism constitutional or not in light of the German Constitution. Some people say that if the German Constitutional Court will declare it unconstitutional, that chaos will ensue. Now, someone was just telling me that Vice Director of the Asian Development Bank just said that chaos might ensue in Asia itself. If the German Constitutional Court declares the European Stability Mechanism Treaty as incompatible with the German Constitution, a major official of the Asian Development Bank says that this will be a crisis of unforeseen consequences for Asia. This tells you everything, not only about the interdependence and at the global level, but also about the interdependence between law and politics, law and economy, and the sensitive role that courts are to play. The German Constitutional Court has to a large extent determine and condition a lot of the things that Mrs. Merkel can or cannot do at the European level to address the crisis. And this, in my view, requires courts and lawyers to upgrade what I call our legal software. Law is not outside these issues, but in order for law to continue to play a socially relevant and useful role, courts and lawyers in general must be able to interpret law in context. And if you want, in the debate, we can address this a little bit in more detail. A third aspect, and it's related to this one, is the extent to which the globalization that we see in economic processes, in political processes, is a globalization we also see in law, and for example through judicial dialogues. Will the German Constitutional Court, if I wanted to be provocative, will the German Constitutional Court be influenced by the Portuguese Constitutional Court decision, for example? In the same way that we might say that the Portuguese Constitutional Court decision was influenced by a famous decision of the German Constitutional Court regarding the salaries of law professors. Why was it law professors? I leave the question in open. The only time that the German Constitutional Court decided that there was unlawful to limit public salaries involved law professors, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with the fact that the court is majoritarily composed by law professors in Germany. And by the way, if you look at the composition of our Constitutional Court and who voted for and against, you could make also very interesting interpretations of that decision. Since I'm in Macau, I can be a little bit more free in that respect. And anyway, now I'm back being an academic, I'm no longer at the court, I can say whatever you want. And it's really interesting, nevertheless, to notice that all the judges that voted for the unconstitutionality of the law in Portugal were both judges that were nominated, let's say, were appointed by the parliament but indicated by the Socialist Party on the one hand, and then also judges that were indicated by the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, but those that were indicated by them were only those that were judges of Korea, that is, civil servants, if we can say that in terms of Korea. That could make a particular interpretation of the decision, but I'm not going to advance that kind of, if you want, legal realist, as the Americans will put it, interpretation of such judicial decision. But if these judicial dialogues that I was mentioning about can tell you something, is that they are one more example, and I will conclude with that, of the cross-fertilization among legal systems that globalization is bringing about, and that crises, such as the crisis of the euro, render even more visible. With economic and social integration, we also witness legal integration. This legal integration does not come, and this I think is the distinguishing factor regarding other forms of integration, other impacts of globalization, doesn't come by global processes of law making necessarily or fundamentally, though we also see that, but doesn't come necessarily by global legislation. It comes in much more informal ways. It comes through networks of judges that exchanges practices and exchanges communication, information on their decisions. Notice the extent to which courts, as I was just mentioning, increasingly cite themselves and use examples of decisions taken by courts in other legal systems. But it comes also by networks of lawyers, academics, but also other lawyers. It comes through the internationalization of law firms. It's very interesting to look at the studies. For example, in Europe, this is particularly visible, of the extent of mergers and internationalization of law firms. And I'm sure this is bound to happen in Asia, and this is actually already happened at the global level itself. It comes also through the increased cross-border nature of cases. Particularly here in Macau, I'm sure you realize that you are increasingly having to operate and to practice law in the context of what we could call a pluralism of legal orders, where you have to, at the same time, be able to navigate between different legal sources and different legal orders, and be able to develop points of contacts between those different legal orders. So if there's something that this crisis tells us, is that we are going to witnessing in law too, a process that will not create uniform law or will not eliminate distinction between legal orders, but where we will witness an increased cross-fertilization between legal orders and an hybridization of legal orders. Legal orders increasingly will be hybrid. They will preserve some of its identity, but with elements from other legal orders. And I will say that Macau is particularly well placed to be at the forefront of that kind of experiment in law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. O nosso período de debate está oficialmente aberto. As perguntas podem ser colocadas em português ou em inglês. Any questions?
Even French or
Even
French,
Italian.
Portuguese, English, Italian,
Italian.
Spanish. Mandarin or Cantonese, I'm afraid, if someone can translate.
Em primeiro lugar, muito obrigado pela sua excelente intervenção. Eu acho que contribui muito para esclarecer alguns pontos do debate. A primeira questão que eu queria pôr, refere-se ao facto, ao primeiro ponto que eu vou. Nós sabemos que desde a Constituição do Governo, no final da década de 90, o que aconteceu foi que os países do Sul perderam 30% a 40% em termos de competitividade. E que esta crise, embora por várias razões não seja salientar, esta crise é uma crise de balança de pagamentos tradicional, o que é que não se reflete como tal, porque ela é automaticamente financiada pelo Banco Central Alemão, através do sistema do target que agora está a ser implementado. Portanto, para resolver normalmente uma crise de balança de pagamentos, há várias vias. Os países com déficit podem ter mais políticas de austeridade, que é a via que tem sido seguida. A outra são os países com superávit seguirem políticas expansionistas. E aqui, por último, qual é a sua opinião sobre a possibilidade disso acontecer na Alemanha? Porque o que acontece é que a Alemanha tem recusado constantemente a seguir esta política expansionista. Portanto, ou seja, choques assimétricos não são resolvidos por políticas simétricas. Portanto, imagino o que é que esta situação está a gerar. O outro ponto refere-se a corrigir esta situação. É a questão do Banco Central Alemão, do Banco Central Europeu ser mais agressivo em termos monetários. Okay? Portanto, o que acontece é que não tem sido. Não significa que não tenham feito muito, porque já fizeram muito. Não é? A questão que se põe é que não são suficientemente agressivos. E essa maior agressividade levaria, com certeza, a um euro muito mais baixo em relação ao dólar. Isso seria um grande contributo para a correção desta assimetria. Portanto, digamos que das três políticas existentes, só uma é que está a ser utilizada. E, portanto, isto tem custos muito elevados. Uma outra questão que se põe é que, relativamente, porque isto, no fundo, quando fala da solidariedade financeira entre os Estados, o problema dessa solidariedade é que a Alemanha é muito dominante dentro da Europa. Nós estamos a falar de uma solidariedade que é desproporcional. Portanto, até atualmente a reforma dizem que, por exemplo, se a Espanha e a Itália tiverem que recorrer ao mecanismo de financiamento europeu, não é? A Alemanha, obviamente, não poderão garantir a parte deles, e, portanto, a Alemanha vai garantir mais de 50%. Portanto, é esta a questão também que temos que ver até que ponto o país poderá suportar todos estes encargos sem ter o poder político que lhe advém daí. E o ponto que se põe é que, se verificar na história da unificação do leste e da Alemanha do Leste com a Alemanha Ocidental, tudo foi decidido em 6 meses, inclusivamente a unificação monetária. Porquê? Porque porque eles eram o mesmo povo, eram a mesma cultura e era um objetivo fundamental que essa unificação se fizesse. Agora, a questão que se põe na Europa é que são povos diferentes, culturas diferentes, etc. Uma outra questão que se coloca é que é relativa à questão que também levantou dos mercados emergentes. Aqui, outra vez, o impacto da globalização é desproporcional, no sentido que a Alemanha é o país que mais beneficia na Europa com a globalização. E a gente aqui na China pode muito bem ver isso pelo número de Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, Audis que andam por aí. Portanto, o que acontece é que se alguns países da Europa quiserem beneficiar da globalização, vai ter que ser através da Alemanha. Ou seja, a Alemanha tem que aplicar as tais, eu digo em termos significativos e com impacto mais imediato, não é? Portanto, isto é outra questão, também me colocava, era até que ponto a Alemanha, que será cada vez mais dependente de outros países, não é? E terá menos interesse dos países do Sul e no processo de integração europeia, porque eles podem perfeitamente, e há pessoas que dizem que isso é exatamente o que poderá estar a acontecer, não é? Eles preveem para os próximos anos um crescimento muito lento no Sul, não é? E, portanto, vão depender cada vez mais de outros mercados e, portanto, para suportar um custo adicional, não é? Por isso, poderá ser, não poderá ser equilibrado do ponto de vista da Alemanha. Ok? Era as questões.
Should we collect a couple more?
I think so. No more?
Esgotou as questões todas. I can start by answering these ones and then answering the others. I don't know, is there, because I don't know if there's persons in here that do not understand Portuguese.
Anyone who don't...
You don't understand. So I'll answer in English. I will answer in English. I think it's more appropriate, if you don't mind. If you don't mind. So let me see. First, the answer, if the answer to the crisis could come through a more expansionist German policy, and why is Germany not doing it? I think that I'm not an economist, but I think the first thing is it's true that it can come, I mean, by a more expansionist policy of some states, as I said, by increasing consumption and therefore buying basically the products of the states that are under adjustment programs, and at the same time by that expansionist policy, hopefully decreasing the overall value of the euro and therefore making exports in general more competitive for all the states in the euro area. And I think that in fact, that in reality there is signs that Germany is doing that. The average salary increases in Germany this year has been, I think, 4%, much higher than the rest of Europe. And I think that 4% salaries for Germany is something, it's path-breaking for a country that is so afraid of inflation and inflationary risks. I think it's revealing that the Germans are understood, and I think the German government understood that it's necessary for them. But I don't think it's enough, and that's how I said that it also has to come by consumption, an increase in consumption and demand from other parts of the globe that are in a better position to grow, like Asia, for example. So part of the solution would also come by rebalancing in terms of international trade. I mean, as wealth is moving from Asia, it makes sense that consumption should increase in Asia, giving broader access to those markets for European products, and not only for the German cars, other European products too, hopefully. As to the question of the European Central Bank, I think that the European Central Bank has a very important and very clear mandate in terms of price stability. And I think that if Europe has the euro, if there is the thing that Europe promised above all to the Germans, was a European central bank that will not be a Federal Reserve, a central bank that will be focused on price stability. We've already, and we try to forget that, we've already made the Germans give up on another guarantee that is in the treaty, that is no bailout. In fact, there were bailouts. And two, I think that is very difficult, and I would say even impossible, that will be the last frontier to be crossed, is to ask for the European Central Bank to have a much more a role like the Federal Reserve in terms of providing liquidity on the market, in terms of actions, in terms of addressing the crisis. It has already expanded its role. It probably could do, there are things that could, maybe the interest rate could be lower even more than it has so far, and that's things that can be debated, but I don't think that we can expect the crisis for the solution for the crisis to come from the European Central Bank. It will be the last frontier that the Germans will allow Europe to cross. As to the fact that Germany and to the lack of solidarity, the fact that Germany is too dominant. Yes, it's too dominant because we depend on German money, and that's one more reason for the solution I propose. That is one where the correction of the asymmetric shocks that are natural in a monetary union and the provision of financial solidarity comes from the EU budget, not through states' budgets. And then we will be totally different, because if we come through the EU budget, then the question is the legitimacy of this EU intervention. And that will depend in terms on the politicization of the European system that I've also argued about. For me, that's the solution. The solution, precisely to avoid that kind of perception that the Germans, on the one hand, they think they have done too much and they don't understand. How is it possible? We've taken, if you go to Germany, like I go, most public opinion, including a good part of their elites, think we've gone too far. We've guaranteeing debts of all these countries, and on top of all, as we say in Portuguese, to use a Portuguese friend, pobres e mal agradecidos. That's how the Germans think about it. We're helping them, and on top of all, they criticize us and they blame us for everything that is happening. And I don't think that necessarily is a consequence of the fact that we have different peoples and we have lack of solidarity. That is a product of a lack of sufficient identity here in Europe. The Bavaria state in Germany, Bavaria, has just started a constitutional complaint against the redistribution of money that goes from Bavaria state for several years to the regions in the east and to places like Berlin, for example. The Berlin Stats and the regions around it, and some of the other regions that have been in deficit for several months, they now claim that within Germany itself, that this permanent transfer of money from some states to other states, it is unconstitutional. So, as you say, it's not for lack of sufficient identity. Even in Portugal, I remember that when I was once asked, I was in Yale, but I was contacted by a Portuguese news channel to comment on a series of issues, and one of the questions was about the crisis in Madeira, and people complaining, we can't continue to pay for Madeira. The continent provides all this money for Madeira, and they are constantly overspending. And I said, well, that's basically more or less what the Germans are saying of us, isn't it? So, I mean, these things are relative. I think that we have to believe that citizens are ultimately rational, make ultimately rational choices. So even if they don't always do so, but at least our best bet is that they will do rational choices. And if that is the case, for me, the source for financial solidarity comes by rendering visible to European citizens that there's a lot of benefits that also arise from interdependence and from the process of European integration. And if we make visible to them those benefits and the potential tremendous costs of a breakup of the euro, for example, people will then be able to pay to support it. And in certain conditions and the legitimate forms of distribution, but the conversation will be a different one. What is really poisoning the conversation at the moment is the understanding that somehow this is simply about some paying for the others with no benefit being related to them. So the Germans, for example, don't realize that one of the reasons why they can sell all these Mercedes and BMWs is because they are part of the euro. That if they didn't have the euro, of course, a lot of merit on Germany too, that underwent structural reforms, that too. But one of the main reasons why they become so competitive at the global level is because of the euro. And they simply haven't realized this. And until they do, they are not able then to be as committed in terms of financial solidarity as they otherwise are. In the same way that the Portuguese, the Irish, and the other ones have to understand that when they decide that in order to be competitive as part of the euro, they also have to undergo structural reforms.
Ok. Mais Sofia.
Limites do direito.
Também falou que há aqui um déficit democrático na União Europeia. A norma que eu queria colocar aqui em causa, já vou ler indiretamente ali, ou diretamente, é a questão do artigo 123 do Tratado da União Europeia, que proíbe, portanto, que o Banco Central Europeu concede créditos.
Aos Estados.
E quando falamos em democracia, é assim, como é que nós queremos, não é, construir uma União Europeia mais democrática? Não é? Quando as pessoas começam a pensar, e eu penso assim, como é que é possível o Banco Central emprestar aos bancos a 1% e depois os bancos emprestarem aos Estados a 5 ou 6%? Isto é um negócio, não é, que arruina a dívida dos países, não é, dos mais pobres. Assim, porquê? Eu preciso de conversar em termos históricos. Qual é a razão que está? Todos nós sabemos que as normas jurídicas transportam valores e interesses. Porquê esta? Quais são os interesses que estão aqui? Porquê? Gostaria que nos desse a oportunidade. Obrigado.
I can answer this one immediately because it's short. It was one of the essential prices to be paid to Germany for Germany to accept the euro. Because then the risk is that the European Central Bank will be pressured by the states to buy and basically be funding debt of the states and generate processes of over indebtedness of states, of too much public debt. That will it will be like having a father with unlimited pockets. That will be the German perception of it. It will be like having a father of unlimited pockets. Funding the drug habit of one of his child. That's how the Germans see it. And in fact, they look at the United States and they don't see that as a good thing. They see it as a bad thing. They think that the United States, sooner or later, that's going to explode. Because the Federal Reserve continues to basically print money. I mean, giving debt to the states is basically that. It will be printing more and more money. And the reason why the Germans are so concerned with those aspects is then the risks of inflationary pressures. And this is an historical factor. I mean, it was the economic crisis linked to very, very strong and deep inflation to which the Germans attribute in part the emergence of the National Socialist Party and the emergence of Hitler. So in the collective psyche of the Germans, inflationary pressures are something that they perceive as terrible and with possible horrible consequences. That's the reason. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that and that's why I said that the change of ECB intervention will be the last frontier that the Germans will accept, in my view.
Just borrow money 7%, 8%, 9%, 10%, 15%, 25%.
So long as the state doesn't default.
Yeah, but from
ask some of the previous lenders of Greece.
Sure, but could states intervene in some way to rule this increasing of interest rates, or is there any special guarantees? Like, for instance, if we buy a house, we will give a mortgage to the bank. It's a guarantee. If we enter in a finance agreement, we will do assignments. We will do I don't know. There are several types of guarantees to be provided to the lenders. In this specific case, is there any way to control the landings? Is there any way to from the state perspective to intervene in the market to stop this increase of interest rates?
I think that the only way is by having clear political authority, as I said, and therefore showing to the markets that if the European, if it is necessary, the European Union will intervene by buying debt or by issuing debt and this kind of thing in such a way that they will end up paying a price if they speculate, and the market rules. But for that you need clear political authority, and that's what you do not have in Europe. You have an entity that has diffuse political authority. That's the big advantage of the United. That's why the UK and the United States, the UK itself, have, as a general level, in general terms, much higher levels, much higher ratios of public debt for GDP, per GDP, with respect to GDP, than the European Union. Yet they are not in trouble. Why? They have a clear political authority. If necessary, they can print money. If they can print money, or issue debts, raise other forms of liquidity, that means that money will devalue. So even if you have a 7% interest rate, it will be worth much less. And that's how you sanction the markets, by making it pay a price in market terms. And it's because those states have the political authority to choose among diverse policy instruments to address the crisis, and you know that there's a clear political will that can be triggered at any moment to do so, that the markets respect it. To some extent, the European Union is not respected by the markets because it has no clear political authority.
And why? Why is that?
Because of the diffuse nature of its political authority. As I said, everything in Europe depends not simply on the agreement of 27 or 17, the number of members of the euro area, leaders. It depends on 27 national political spaces, including their constitutional courts, that can block at any moment something that is decided. Once you have that, how can you provide certainty? The problem in Europe is actually not too much concentration of power to what people. The democratic problem in Europe is one that is linked actually to power that is too much diffuse, absence of strong political authority.
I understand that, but how can a currency be created without having an authority to be able to control and rule over that currency?
Well, I mean, there's two theories.
The people who thought about the euro and everything and created it wouldn't be able to foresee the scenario that we are facing now?
There is two theories. One, that they didn't foresee it, that they were too wishful thinking, only thought about the benefits, and didn't think that somehow thought that that it will be possible that the stability, the kind of informal arrangements to guarantee fiscal discipline will be enough, and didn't expect it something such as the financial crisis of 2008. This is one theory. The other theory is the idea that they did expect such a crisis, but they thought that it happened in the past, but this time in a much more dramatic way, that the crisis itself will trigger the political will to then establish that political authority and those mechanisms of governance. And this is what we are now seeing, if it's going to happen or not. This is going to be tested now. If that was their expectation, we are now the guinea pigs, if you want. We are now seeing whether or not they were right, whether the crisis will be such that it will create the incentives for that move. And some people say that even their expectation was that this will be the kind. Some people see it. This as the failure of functional integration in Europe. That is, integration by small steps, where one thing triggers the other. They say this shows that it's not enough. They should only have done the economic monetary union if there was a political integration at the same time. Other people see it as the opposite, that this will be the ultimate confirmation of functional integration. That is, that because we created monetary union, that it will then trigger, finally, deep political integration. We will see. I think that the risk is that there's a third alternative. It is that we'll end up with a serious collapse, not only of the euro, but of European integration and its member states itself. But when I talk about a serious collapse, I really mean a serious collapse. We cannot underestimate the risks of what is taking place in Europe.
So is the crisis looming for 2030?
We are in crisis already, but what I think is that if there is a kind of collapse with several states leaving the euro, for example, that the social economic consequences will be tremendously dire. As something as we have not witnessed in Europe in decades. And then I fear even the possible social and political consequences of that.
So you are expecting the worst?
I don't expect the worst, but I don't exclude it at all. For example, I admit the possibility then of the European Union itself breaking up. Certainly, if the euro will collapse. There's a very high risk of that happening.
If the European Union has ended by itself, we have a model living for 65 years that was built in a time of growing. Don't you think that is, and the British probably are right, there is time, now is the time to think what Europeans want about Europe?
No, I think now is the time to think what Europeans want about Europe. But I don't think, I think that the costs of trying to put the genius back inside the bottle will be extremely high. I think that the level of interdependence that will be generated, particularly those that are within the euro area, is such that the costs will be tremendously high. So, but I think the discussion needs to be had. I'm also not happy with the idea that somehow we are going to sell to European citizens a much deeper level of integration by just telling them there is no alternative. There is an alternative. That is to say, we break up the euro, we try to have a free trade area, but those that defend that alternative then also have to make clear that the costs of reduction of that interdependence and the transition costs from having the euro to not have the euro will be tremendous. Will be certainly much higher than what people are suffering already in countries like Greece and Portugal and all that. And the particular aspect is that we do not sure of the extent of those costs. They may be even higher than the best estimations the worst estimations that are done. The example I give is like climate change. Maybe if we look through centuries, maybe it's true. There's been increases in temperature and other ones. Maybe the Earth will be able again to re-establish climate again to a previous form. But do we want to bet what might be our future on it? And that's the kind of decision that Europeans have to do. We might try again to go back to a much lower level of economic integration. And I have to say something. The UK, I think it's very likely that the UK will leave the European Union. And in this case, I would say it's very likely. And I think it's much more possible for them because they are not part of the euro. So they will not have those kinds of transition costs of the level of interdependence that the other ones have already arrived. It's easier. But I also will make the other prediction. 20 years after they will leave, they will be knocking, within 20 years, if not within 10, they will be knocking on Europe's door to get in again. Because the only alternative that they will have, I don't think it will be to stay within Europe, within the internal market, but outside the European Union. But that's what Norway has. And I think that that's what the British will like. But once they will start discovering that will mean that they will still be subject to the financial regulations adopted by the European Union member states. Because this is the paradox. Norway is part of the European Economic Area to benefit from the internal market. The consequence for Norway is that as part of the internal market is not only that they benefit from free movement, they have to conform, they have to comply with all legislation that the European Union adopts in the context of the internal market, and in which they have no saying whatsoever. So if the British think that they can be part of the internal market and not comply with financial regulation rules adopted by EU institutions, they are wrong. That's what they don't realize. In fact, they will have to comply with them, because that's the nature of the European Economic Agreement.
Doutor, tenho uma questão. Há alguma experiência histórica de mercados de menor em vários países, sem haver uma autoridade política, uma autoridade monetária comum, uma política monetária e uma política fiscal comum?
No.
Algum caso historicamente que
No, there isn't.
Então o euro é uma experiência.
It is an experiment. It is an experiment. There are experiments that work, and there are other experiments that don't work. There are experiments that produce fantastic results.
Doutor, não sei se quer.
Deu-me um mote que a pergunta depois foi ali, pedida pelo Dr. Gonçalo, mas primeiro de tudo queria-lhe agradecer e dar os parabéns pela demonstração, pela explicação que lhe deu. Não sei se seria possível aos políticos na Europa fazer aí às suas populações em geral para ficarem esclarecidas, não sei se haveria interesse. De qualquer das maneiras, uma questão que eu queria pôr aqui, e tinha a ver com uma coisa que foi aqui já tocada, sobre a hipótese de referendo que foi há cerca de 2-3 semanas invocada pelo primeiro-ministro inglês, no sentido da Inglaterra se virar, não. Que vem no seguimento de uma posição mais também fracionada dos países nórdicos em relação a começar pela Holanda, Dinamarca e por aí fora, no sentido de não pagarem aos países de fuga. Já foi dada a resposta que porventura vão sair, e que talvez venha a dar razão à chamada política da cadeira vazia da França, quando a entrada, ao fim destes anos todos, que o Charles de Gaulle queria que os ingleses entrassem para a União Europeia, porque vinham no sentido de não ajudarem antes de aplicar. Uma pergunta última só que eu queria fazer era isto. Havendo a regra de ouro em termos de orçamento para todos os países, havendo uma grande dúvida, como disse, uma nuvem negra sobre uma política fiscal uniforme em toda a Europa, em toda a União Europeia, não alcançar essa política fiscal, qual o futuro da Europa, qual o futuro do euro?
Pode repetir esse último lado?
Havendo a regra de ouro, em termos de orçamentos de Estado, se é necessária essa regra de ouro, uma política fiscal uniforme em toda a União, não alcançasse essa política fiscal, consequências para o euro e para a União Europeia.
I think that the policy could mean an authority of the European Union in supervising national fiscal policies. For example, in vetoing and controlling national budgets. Right? And I think that's what people normally mean. And I think that's what's in the works, basically. That's what's in the works. That is an increased role of the European Union in determining what states can or cannot do with their national budgets, and that will make it. That will have two consequences with respect to the Golden Rule. In a certain sense, paradoxically, if the European Union will have a very strong voice on what national budgets cannot be, the European Union indirectly becomes also co-responsible, whether or not the states are able to meet that Golden Rule. And that's, I think, it's an important consequence. But what concerns to me is that I think that a role of where the European Union, with respect to member states, only appears as the schoolmaster, has the discipline that only imposes discipline, only tells states what they cannot do, only sanctions states, is bound to undermine the social and political conditions that support the legitimacy of the process of European integration. And that's why I think that any growth in EU supervisory powers, in terms of control of national fiscal policies must come hand in hand with a much stronger role of the European Union in terms of an increase in its budget and an increase of European Union direct interventions in the states, also for correcting asymmetric shocks. That is, I think that, as it is the case with the United States, that the well-functioning fiscal union needs a whip, but it also a stick, but also needs carrots. And if the European Union will only have a stick and will have no carrots, it's bound to be socially and politically destructive for the process of European integration. And by the way, talking about the United States, that reminds me that actually maybe there is an example of a monetary union without strong political authority in the beginning. The United States, when it started. It was because of a fiscal crisis in terms of the states that the United States then moved from a confederation to become a federal, adopted the Constitution, because the federal government then took up the debt of the states, and at the time they were not so. And moreover, it was again, in terms of the economic crisis on the 30s, that there was a much stronger increase in terms of social transfers from the federal government to the states. So maybe there is an example, it's the United States. Might not be the good example.
In conclusion, in your opinion, we need much Europe.
Yeah, we need more Europe, but it also depends on what I think is that this more Europe must be constructed in a way that renders visible to citizens, as I said at the beginning, the benefits of European integration. I think that it's fundamental for us to change the nature of the discourse in Europe from being one where we talk about the transfers of some states to other states to being one where we discuss what is Europe to do with the wealth that is generated by the process of European integration. If the discourse will be this, we'll be able to do many things that now seem impossible for us to do.
Só. Muito obrigada a todos por terem vindo. Once again, thank you for coming, and we hope in the name of Rui Cunha Foundation, we hope to see you soon. Esperemos vê-los em breve, em setembro, já na nossa próxima conferência. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigado.